The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fruit and Vegetable Magazine's webinar on understanding and managing aphids. My name is Jennifer Page, and I'm the editor of Fruit and Vegetable Magazine. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. In this webinar, our presenter, Hannah Fraser from Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs will discuss aphids and how they impact tree fruits in Canada. After developing a better understanding of aphids, their development and impact, Anne McCrae, technical specialist with BASF, will introduce Versus insecticide, the latest tool in aphid management from BASF. Before we get started, there's a couple housekeeping items I'd like to go over. We will hold a question and answer period once both presentations have concluded. During the presentations, we encourage you to type your questions into the questions text box in the GoToWebinar panel. This session is also being recorded and will be sent to those who have registered in a follow-up email 24 hours after the live event. We are all ready, so I'll now pass things over to Hannah to get us started.
Yes, hello everybody, welcome. I'm very pleased and would like to thank the organizers for putting this webinar together. For this webinar, I'm going to be covering the basics of aphid biology, but I've been asked to focus on tree fruit aphids in terms of their crop injury management, timing, and control options, but this should provide some nice foundational information for everybody as we move forward. Aphids encompass a really large group of insects. There are over 4,000 species described and over 600 in Canada. Many of these are considered destructive plant pests, either through direct injury or as vectors of plant diseases. Aphids, which are also called plant lice, are small, soft-bodied insects that suck plant sap. They're a really diverse group, and even within a single species, there can be different morphs or shapes, sizes, and functions within a colony. They're small, relatively soft-bodied, 1 to 4 millimeters in size, and although we describe them as fragile, they're not quite as defenseless as you'd think. I wanted to get into this for this presentation, but don't have time, so stay tuned for another webinar. They do have piercing, sucking mouth parts, which of course is what they use to feed on the plants and what causes much of the injury to the plants that they're on. They're highly variable in terms of their coloration. They can have waxy or woolly coverings. They can have hairs on them as well. They can have wingless forms as adults as well as winged. They have long antennae that normally fold back over the body. They have 2 cornicles, those structures that you'll see on the picture at the bottom end of the aphid. These are sometimes greatly reduced in size, just really down to a pore. And these are used to emit alarm pheromones as well as some defensive compounds. And then there's that little cotta that you can see at the bottom, and that aphids will use to flick droplets of honeydew away from themselves as they're excreted. All of these features are important from the standpoint of aphid identification. Probably all the aphids that you see in today's presentation are relatively easy to distinguish from one another, but that isn't always the case depending on what crop you're in. I really like this slide, and I use it a lot in presentations because it illustrates a lot of the common life cycle of many species we find in Canada. Of course, there are variations. Many aphids that overwinter in Canada usually do so in the form of an egg, which is where they are right now, and it's often on perennial hosts. In the springtime, when the daylight hours start to increase and the temperatures rise, those little eggs will hatch, and the developing nymphs will start to feed on nearby plant tissues, such as the leaf or flower buds. All of these nymphs at this time would be females. They molt several times, and when they reach maturity, these females start to give birth to live nymphs. All of them are clones of one another, and they in turn mature and produce offspring of their own. Typically, they'll produce several wingless generations in the spring, and then a winged generation that moves on to other hosts of either the same plant species or alternative summer hosts. Most aphid species feed on one or a few related hosts, while some, like the green peach aphid, have a large range of hosts. Winged females are also produced during conditions of crowding. Several generations may occur on summer hosts, but eventually those females will move back to overwintering hosts. Males are produced, these mate with the females on the overwintering host, and females lay that overwintering egg. This asexual mode of reproduction, combined with a short generation time, allows aphids to rapidly attain high population densities that can injure crops. So aphids do occur in colonies. Sometimes they can be really dense. In this slide here of lupin aphids, you can see adults and you can see nymphs of various different size and age. You can see some winged adults as well. You can also see a cast skin, which is left behind when the aphid molts to the next stage. And if you look closely, you can also see a couple of yellow larvae, which are predatory midge that feed on those aphids. We'll talk briefly about natural enemies and biocontrol later on in this presentation. So aphids feed on the sap using those delicate nose parts that we call stylets. They're generally phloem feeders, but they'll also feed on the contents of the xylem, or the outer layer of plant tissues. Even though the injury they produce may look small relative to an insect with, let's say, chewing mouth parts, their feeding can produce profound changes in the plant, especially when they're present in really large numbers. Direct injury results in a variety of symptoms, including reduced growth, reduced vigor, mottling, browning, curling, or the development of galls, and in some cases, the death of the plant. Indirect injury includes the production of honeydew that encourages the development of a dark sooty mold. That sooty mold is visually unappealing, but it can also block sunlight and reduce plant vigor. But honeydew can also attract ants, which protect aphids by warding off predators and parasitoids, and in some cases can affect the degree of biocontrol against aphids. In addition, of course, aphids are really important vectors of plant diseases. With the exception of a few highly generalist aphid species, most specialize on just one or a few closely related plants. Winged females have to make important decisions when they're deciding where to land and start producing their small armies of nymphs. Not every plant is going to be suitable for colonization, depending on how specialized that aphid species is. The hosts are chosen by visual cues, followed by odor and taste. That stylet is inserted, there's saliva excreted, the xylem gets tasted, the phloem gets tested, and non-host plants can be rejected at any time during that process. One of the other things that is challenging from an aphid standpoint is that the sap is really high in sugar, which creates problems with water balance in the aphid, and it's also very low in essential amino acids. So to compensate, the aphids excrete lots of honeydew, and they have an obligate relationship with endosymbiotic bacteria that provide their hosts with these essential amino acids in exchange for a place to live. Aphids are also excellent vectors of plant viruses. Viruses can modify the chemical and physical properties of plants such that they can be more or less attractive to aphids, which is really adaptive for the virus in terms of getting spread. So there's two general types of spread by viruses, non-persistent and persistent. Non-persistent transmission is virtually exclusive to aphids, who pick up the virus particles during very brief stylet penetrations of the epidermal layer, and as that aphid is just initially tasting the plant, so very short little feeding probes. Most of these non-persistent viruses are found in the epidermal layer, and so a winged aphid who picks up a non-persistent virus and rejects the plant will carry the virus onto the next plant they feed on. But the virus basically gets washed off during that next feeding probe. It doesn't stay with the aphid. In persistent viruses, they require extended feeding, and they're often located in the phloem sap. They take time to circulate in the insect, and they move into the gut and the salivary glands. Aphids transmit persistent viruses as well, but so do several other insects. There's a really interesting area of study that talks about interaction of aphids and plants that they feed on. It could be another hour-long webinar just in itself. But plants themselves, they're not actually without defense against insects that are feeding on them. They have different surface waxes that can act as physical barriers. They have hairs on them that can be irritating and affect the movement of aphids. They can have surface repellents. They can have chemical plugging that occurs in their sap that makes it really hard to suck up. They can have compounds in them that interfere with the aphid's gut or its development or if it's fecundity. And plants can also send off signals that alert predators and parasitoids that there's little tasty little aphids that they should come and feed on. So really, really interesting area of study, and I encourage people to look into this if they'd like to find out more. So I'd like to get on to talking about some of these tree fruit aphids, and I'm going to break this down into apples and stone fruit, and I'm going to cover the main species that we find. So there's three common aphid pests of apples that we find here in Ontario: the green apple aphid, the rosy apple aphid, and woolly apple aphid. So green apple aphids are green. They have black cornicles, they have black legs, the antennal tips are black. The nymphs are ranging in color from kind of a yellowish green to a darker green. The adults are also relatively dark green. and they can be winged or wingless. Those winged forms have a darker head and a thorax. You can see them on the left-hand side. The winged forms tend to be narrower and less fecund than their flightless counterparts because some of the energy needs are diverted to that production of wings. But both the winged and wingless morphs are about 3 millimeters in length. Note that the green apple aphids you're looking at may actually be spirea aphid, which looks like green apple aphid and has displaced it or coexists with it in apple in many areas. And I also wanted to point out that ant in the picture above. I mentioned the presence of ants can influence the level of aphid biocontrol, and we'll often see ants tending green apple aphid and especially rosy apple aphid, much like a herd of cattle. It's a pretty interesting area of study, again, looking at the negative impacts of ants on biocontrol. In terms of the biology of green apple aphid, this overwinters, and it's one of many that overwinters on the bark of apple, and later we'll talk about prunus. But they overwinter as shiny black eggs on smooth twigs and suckers at the base of buds on terminal shoots. They will hatch as the buds begin to expand from silver tip to about half-inch green. There can be multiple overlapping generations per year from bud break to late summer when those sexual forms get produced. And the winged females can move to new trees anytime during the season. Green apple aphid hosts include apple, pear, hawthorn, and quince, but they are commonly found on apple, and they don't have summer hosts. They will remain on the apple for the entire season. This is just a slide showing some of the eggs. You can see some little green eggs and some black eggs. Those green ones were probably more recently laid. They will darken over time. And the egg is the stage of the aphid that is able to resist our cold temperatures here in temperate regions. Many of them might be killed by the cold this year, but invariably some of them will survive and will hatch out and start producing aphid colonies again later in the season. So green apple aphids, they will feed on the developing leaves. They're usually found close to major veins on the underside of the leaf. Sometimes if there are lots of them, they will spill over onto the other side. And they are often found in really large numbers. You will find them on shoots and on water sprouts, and sometimes you'll find them on the fruit. When they've been feeding on fruit, you'll see them as little red spots that usually disappear by harvest time. Lush terminal growth really promotes population increases of green apple aphid and other aphids, and the numbers tend to decrease after the terminals harden off. So over-fertilization really needs to be avoided where possible to prevent excessive terminal growth because, again, this attracts the aphids. Summer pruning can be avoided until terminal buds have set to prevent that shoot regrowth. And just pay attention to the weather because in years with abundant rainfall, when there's a flush of regrowth, we really see green apple aphid numbers rebounding. So in terms of the injury, green apple aphids suck sap from leaves, and the feeding doesn't really harm established trees so much, but it can reduce the bud size and internode length, so it can stunt young trees, and it can affect the tree architecture. The visual appearance of green apple aphids in trees is often worse than the injury caused by their feeding, such as that copious amounts of honeydew. You can see that on the right-hand side. And then that subsequent colonization by the sooty black fungus that actually is feeding on that honeydew. This can sometimes result in rusted areas on the fruit, especially around the stem, and although it can be washed off in lines, you'll sometimes find it stuck in the stem cavity. And of course, it's really annoying from the standpoint of working in apple and harvesting it. In Ontario, green apple aphid is rarely occurring at levels that require intervention. Our monitoring for it involves looking at about 100 terminals per block and looking at a percentage of the terminals with aphid colonies. The numbers that you see here of 400 to 600 aphids per terminal on 10% or more of terminals, people will usually do a rough estimate, but that 10% is important. But it's important for young trees, so for young trees, not big established trees. And of course, if natural enemies are present in the colonies, 20% or more, you can often delay your sprays or eliminate them entirely. And that slide is just showing that activity period as a reminder of when they're active in apple. So I wanted to move on to the next aphid in apple, and that's rosy apple aphid. This is a significant pest of apple in Ontario in terms of aphids, and in the other provinces as well. And early recognition that it's there and active is really important for successful management. In terms of describing the aphid, it's a dull pinkish color, can be purpley gray, and it has a bit of a waxy bloom on it. Not anything like woolly apple aphid, but it does have a bit of a waxy bloom to it. It also has very long cornicles and antennae. This slide here is just a close-up of one of the colonies there. You can see the nymphal stages of different sizes. You can see some mature females and lots and lots of cast skins. You can see that variation in color. So colonies are often quite dense, and the leaves are really heavily curled up. After a few generations, when conditions become crowded, the winged females will begin to appear. Rosies are rarely found attacking young and rapidly growing shoots. They tend to be restricting themselves to the foliage associated with flower stalks and young fruits. Their saliva is extremely toxic to apple. Feeding on the leaves of the fruit clusters can result in bunching or stunting, malformations of the fruit, which becomes noticeable as it gets larger. So there's some pictures there of the fruit that's been affected by rosy apple feeding. It's malformed. We sometimes have referred to it as pygmy fruit. The toxins in the saliva also serve as a stop drop. They can prevent the normal abscission around harvest time. And of course, chemically thinning fruit around infested clusters can be really hard. It can cause those leaves to curl up and become a bright crimson color. And that leaf curling does not usually become obvious until after petal fall. That saliva can also reduce growth of roots and woody tissue, and research has shown that this can have an important impact on young trees as they develop. So again, with rosy apple aphid, like green apple aphid, it overwinters on apple as eggs on the bark and usually at the base of the buds. And egg hatch usually will occur between about silver tip and half-inch green as well. And the young, as soon as they hatch, they really seek out the opening buds of the apple. They seem to prefer the fruit buds. They'll feed on the outside of the buds until the leaves begin to unfold, and then they kind of work their way inside the clusters where they'll continue to feed. There are usually 3 generations on apple, and then they will move on to their summer host, which is various plantain species. Sometimes we've seen a 4th generation of them here in Ontario, but usually they'll move out sometime mid-July onwards. We do have some well-established thresholds for rosies. It involves looking at fruit clusters, so quite early on, before the leaves are starting to roll up from their feeding injury. So if you're looking at about 100 clusters, so let's say 5 clusters from 20 trees in the case of small trees, or in the case of larger trees, about 10 clusters from 10 trees. And a cluster is considered infested if it has more than 20 aphids present, and if more than 5% of the clusters are infested, it's time to treat for rosies, noting that even a single aphid can actually cause some injury that's detectable. So since they can really get out of hand quickly, some growers and consultants kind of go by the presence instead of the actual threshold. So it's important to find out what people are doing in your region and what works. Because a lot of our thresholds that were developed some time ago, and apple orchards have certainly changed over the years. Growers in 2017 got really hit hard by both rosies and green. It was kind of cool and wet, and there was lots of lush growth, and we saw lots of malformed fruit that year. In particular, rosy apple aphid was really high. So I've been reminded to warn people to watch the weather. And of course, there are some varieties that are more susceptible, like Cortland, Ida Red, and Golden Delicious. So there are a number of different products that are available for rosies and green. I hope I've listed everything up here. Delayed dormant oil applications targeting European red mite, overwintering eggs, and scale insects can also help to suppress rosies and green apple aphid without affecting their predators. I mentioned that green apple aphid is not usually an economic pest for us, but rosies is in most years. And again, they tend to go unnoticed until that leaf curl damage is observed. But at that point, they're protected and they're harder to control, and they've already caused injury to the fruit. So they can really sneak up on you. The best timing for rosies is early in the season. And as I mentioned, there's a number of different products to choose from. Of course, it's important to pay attention to what group you're working with and to avoid the tendency to grab for the same product all the time. You can also look at what other pests are present, and you may want to save some of your tools for later in the season. Just as an example, at some of our high-pressure sites, growers might choose to use something like a Savento Prime or a closer because it's also effective for scale. In Ontario, we have growers who are dealing with European apple sawfly, so they might use a Sail and Calypso to get that pest and at the same time hit their aphids. Again, if you have San Jose scale, leaf curling midge, and woolly apple aphid, Movento might be a good product, although it takes time to work. So you really take a look at what you have and what products you have and come up with a plan for how you're going to manage things through the season. And just to take note here, I've got these products in different colors, and Movento is green and the others are blue and the oils are black. And really what this is for is it's just showing that there are different types of action, and it's another visual way that people are starting to use to show how different products work. So on to woolly apple aphid. This is a really serious pest in Ontario, or it can be a serious pest in Ontario, more so in high density blocks. We're finding more of this in the last few years. Basically, the colonies appear as a cottony mass, and that wax is produced from glands on the insect. And it helps protect them from desiccation as well as natural enemies, and actually helps protect them against pesticide sprays as well. The wax is actually lost each time a nymph molts, and the early instar nymph doesn't have nearly as much wax as the later ones. But by the time they reach maturity, they've got quite a lot of wax, and that's when they become really obvious, especially when they're there in numbers. This woolly apple aphid actually evolved on hawthorn trees and used elm as an overwintering host. And of course, we don't have a lot of elm around here anymore. Woolly apple aphid is adapted to using apple as its sole host in many areas. Its reproduction on apple is asexual, so it does not produce those overwintering eggs that we see with rosies and green apple aphid. It overwinters as a mature female in the roots or bark crevices, and it starts to produce crawlers early in the season that will migrate into the aerial parts of the trees to initiate colonies. That migration can actually start pretty early. It can start around tight cluster, but it continues to midsummer, and you can actually have this continuous movement of these crawlers with a peak migration usually sometime in June. Those root colonies can be found at any time of year, and there again, they're a source of reinfestation of the aerial parts. And we usually see about 3 to 4 generations per year. So what do they do? Well, woolly apple aphid feeding forms knots or galls on twigs or on roots, and that can cause issues with terminal growth and branch set, and it can make the site more prone to winter injury. The stem galls can rupture, and this can cause sort of openings for cankers to colonize. The above ground colonies of aphids can develop around leaf axils on sprouts or on new growth, particularly at abrasions or cuts, and they can prevent the injured bark from healing properly. The infestations can actually kill nearby fruit buds from being formed for next year, and that can result in areas of blind wood. Of course, the underground colonies can form galls on the roots, and heavy infestations can reduce the growth or cause the death of young trees. The foliage of infested trees usually looks pretty yellowish, and they pull up pretty readily when they're infested. So woolly apple aphid are usually observed around the end of June. As I mentioned, the crawlers can be active earlier than that. A lot of the monitoring for woolies involves looking for that cottony, waxy coverings on those pruning cuts, limbs, and trunks, and again, that usually shows up a little bit later. People will often mark trees or areas where they know they've had woolies before, and will keep an eye on that. There's no real good threshold for woolies. The management basically is that, if you're starting to see the colonies near the fruit clusters or on really young trees, it's time to manage them. And as I mentioned, for us, it's becoming more of an issue in high density blocks. They seem to spread quickly from tree to tree along the trellis system. And some of the new training systems tend to have some really lush growth because of the tendency towards this renewal pruning. So it's something for us to be watching for. In terms of managing woolies, again, there are a number of different products that are labeled. Many of these provide kind of, suppression. Some of that may be rate related. In Ontario, we tend to away from products that are harsher on beneficials. from pink onwards. Neonicotinoids, so those group 4 insecticides are not effective against woolly apple aphid. We found good control with Movento, but there are some additional tools that do work well. So same comments really apply to what I said for the rosies and green in terms of choosing your product according to what else is there. And I just wanted to mention that for woolies, there's a really great biocontrol. Woolly apple aphid is native to our region, and so is Aphelinus malai. It's a little parasitic wasp, and it's actually because woolly apple aphid has been spread all over the world. Well, this parasitoid has as well, and it's a really important biocontrol agent where its numbers are high. So I'm going to take a shift from apple, and I'm going to move into stone fruit. The 3 main aphids that we see in stone fruit are green peach aphid, black peach aphid, and black cherry aphid. So I just wanted to go over those briefly. In terms of green peach aphid, it's really the most common species that we see in peach and nectarine in Ontario. And from a commercial standpoint, it's really the only one that growers are managing in those crops. Green peach aphid is also the most important aphid pest worldwide. It has a really, really large host range, so it's not a picky eater. The adults are about 2 millimeters in size, and they can be really variable in color, greens, yellows, pinks, reds. The aphid is generally, I guess, it's kind of pale overall. It can have little dark tips on the cornicles. And I mentioned here the antennal tubercles, which was they actually had a picture of them early on, and I meant to show them to you or point them out to you. It's maybe not so important for the pests that we're talking about in apples from an identification standpoint, but if you were a vegetable producer, you might be in a crop where you've got multiple green aphids, and you do need to be able to tell them apart, and looking at those features and how they point away from each other or towards each other is important. This insect is also notorious for developing resistance to insecticides worldwide. This is just a picture of a close-up of some of the green peach aphid. They're often found along the mid-vein of the leaves. You can see here some adults with wings as well as mature females and a whole bunch of different nymphs of various sizes. So this is yet another aphid that overwinters as an egg on prunus in bud axils and crevices on the twigs. And those little nymphs, when they hatch out around bud break, sometimes earlier, they will start to feed on the blossoms and then the growing shoots and the leaves. And after 2 or 3 generations, the winged forms will move to produce several generations on their summer host. And then again in the fall, they'll come back to that overwintering host to lay those eggs. So it's kind of that classic, like the classic picture I showed you earlier on when I started this. And again, it is a serious pest in a number of veggie crops as well. This is just one of the things that green peach aphid does when it feeds in peaches. It will induce the leaves to curl up, and of course that helps to protect the aphids from negative environmental conditions and in some cases pesticides as well. So you'll get that really, really heavily infested terminals where all of the leaves just completely curl up, and sometimes they will actually fall off as well. So green peach aphids, they will cause infestations on the blossoms and the new shoots, and that can cause the flowers and the leaves to curl up and stop growing. Sometimes you'll get fruitlets that stop growing, or they may not grow at all and they'll drop. You can get deformation of the peaches, and it's quite a serious problem in nectarine when the aphids decide to move on to the fruit, because that feeding causes streaks on the fruit, russeting and bumpy, and basically the fruit is unmarketable. So thresholds for aphids on nectarine is actually lower than it is for peach. Again, you'll see that sooty mode developing, where there's lots of honeydew on the fruit. And again, it's an important vector of a number of different plant viruses in many crops. And in the standpoint of peaches for us in Ontario, it is one of several vectors of plumpox virus. So black peach aphid is not really one that we find a lot in Ontario, but it is reported in other areas, including the province of BC, where it's pretty common. It's a dark brown. It's about the same size as green peach aphid, but it's a dark brown to black and kind of shiny. It has dark cornicles on it. The immatures, and you can see some pictures, you can see some in the picture below, they're more of a yellowish color. They become dark brown as they age. These aphids overwinter as adults in the roots of prunus, so not as eggs. And they also do have summer hosts that they will move on to. The colonies will develop in leaves, causing injury that's similar to green peach aphid. But one of the things with black peach aphid is that it can cause colonies in the roots of young trees, and that can cause stunting in their growth and predispose them to other stresses. And finally, I wanted to cover black cherry aphids. So these aphids are a little bit larger than green peach aphid and the black peach aphid that I've already talked about. They're a dark brown to black, and they're quite shiny, and again, dark cornicles. And the nymphs are kind of an amber to a dark brown. They're really the only dark-colored aphid that we find attacking cherry. They do overwinter as eggs on the cherry, like in the bud axils, and their summer hosts are mustards and are mostly mustards, but they do have others as well. Some of the injury that you'll see with black cherry aphid is reduced shoot extension. You can find deformation of the fruits, blossom injury, reduced fruit size and yield. Heavy infestations can cause stunting of young trees, as with some of the other aphids we've talked about. Again, there are issues with the honeydew and the sooty mold and scorching of leaves. And it is important from a monitoring standpoint to look during and after bud break. So in terms of monitoring aphids in stone fruit, we don't have great thresholds for black cherry aphid. For peach trees, what we do is we look at the percentage of infested terminals. So if 30% or more of the terminals are infested, or if you're seeing more than 20 colonies per tree for peaches, it's time to take action. For nectarines, as I mentioned, the threshold is less. It's 10%, and that's because of that potential movement onto the fruit. So 10% infested colonies, or 5 to 10 colonies per tree for nectarines, or also for young or non-bearing peach trees, and even mature peach trees if they're under water stress. And you need to start looking for these sort of shortly during and shortly after bud break for signs of the aphids. In terms of controls for aphids, and I mentioned this for apples as well, is that sometimes delayed dormant oil applications that are targeting European red mite, as well as scale, can also help to suppress green peach aphid and black cherry aphid because they overwinter as eggs on the tree. And of course, there are a number of different insecticides that also are available. And incidentally, I think it's important, not all of these are registered on every single crop, so it's very important to take a look at the label to find out which pest is registered on, let's say, cherry versus peach or nectarine, and to verify the rate as well. But you can see there is a range of products, and again, that whole take a look at what's available and what other pests that you might be dealing with. And the timing, the time of year, is it the right choice for that time of year given what the pest is doing in terms of its development? So different areas may have different recommendations. Most of our control for aphids in stone fruit in Ontario occurs after petal fall, but it may occur earlier elsewhere. I wanted to show this slide here. It's a picture of our activity of insecticides on apple pests. So this is in publication 360 from Apple, but we also have it in I think actually we have it for all of our different tree fruit pests and in our guide. But what you can do is you can see what's labeled for the different pests, and you can see the sort of a general efficacy, and it'll also show you what other pests it might target at the same time. So that we think that's a good tool for helping people make those decisions and kind of maximizing your use of a product. So I just have a few more slides to go over here towards the end, but of course, integrated pest management of aphids, as with other pests, is really important. And I always kind of look at it as kind of informed pest management. You have to really understand the pest biology. You have to understand how to monitor for it and how to interpret your records. You have to know how to use thresholds, understand the importance of natural enemies, and be able to recognize them. There's also the whole integration of cultural, mechanical techniques. And all of those things are part of an IPM program. And of course, if those things are not keeping pace with the pests, then it's time to use other tools, including insecticides that you have available for you. Just a few comments about things like cultural control, but there are ways to harness what's going on in the plant and the aphid life cycle to help reduce pest pressure. For example, you might want to treat perennial cankers to help reduce woolly apple aphid, removing suckers in the spring to eliminate sources of population development, pruning out water sprouts, painting large pruning cuts. Cultural practices that affect nitrogen and moisture can have a big impact on availability of the feeding site. So vegetative growth or the nutritional quality that's in the plant, like the sugars, amino acids, and even plant defensive compounds. The phloem sap availability, the microclimate, through leaf transpiration and leaf temperature, all these things can discourage the buildup of aphids. And again, I had mentioned nitrogen earlier when I was referring to aphid development. In some cases, reflective mulches can be used, perhaps not so much in tree fruit, but they can be used to help discourage colonization of migrating aphids in some of the veggie crops that we have. In some cases, they're resistant varieties, and in some cases, managing weed hosts can also have an impact on aphids, although perhaps not so much from the standpoint of our tree fruit aphids. Then there's the whole aspect of enhancing biological control. I mentioned that woolly apple aphid has a really important little wasp that will attack it that's native. But you can do things to encourage these bios, like providing them shelter and alternative food sources, so ground cover, flower strips, hedgerows. Consider their presence in action thresholds and look at the different products that are available using pesticides that are less harmful to beneficials when you have that opportunity. So there's a whole bunch of different predators that you can find in orchards: syrphid flies, lacewings, lady beetles, aphid midges. There's a few that you'll see when you're scouting. You might also find soldier beetles or long-legged flies or predatory bugs or beetles and lots of other things. So there are lots of different predators, and there are lots of different parasitoids that are out there that are helping to do the job, although sometimes they need some help. In terms of toxicity of pesticides, we do have some charts in our publication that people might find useful to take a look at. And I just threw this in here. It's a slide showing the some of the ways that you can help promote bios in your orchard. This work was done in the West, and it showed that by providing strips of Alyssium flowers, that woolly apple aphid was suppressed by natural enemies. It was an interesting study, although I have seen studies from other regions that have been less conclusive. Just a few final comments about resistance management. Insecticides are one of the many tools. You need to use them wisely. In order to minimize the selection of resistance to any one type, you need to be looking at alternation, sequences, or rotations of compounds. So take a look at the letters, take a look at the numbers. Applications arranged into mode of action spray windows or blocks defined by the stage of crop pest development and the biology of the pest can really, really help. The main thing is really don't treat the successive generations with compounds from the same mode of action, and that will help, I guess, reduce the development of resistance. Green peach aphid, again, it's notorious for developing resistance. If you go to the Insecticide Resistance Action Site webpage, you'll find that they have put together some really interesting stuff, informative stuff on this and other pests. It's a great site. I find that there's so much information it can be sometimes really hard to get through it all, though. So just there is a new website that's being developed now, CropLife Canada. They have developed one for weeds. But basically what it is it shows the different mechanisms of resistance, case studies, videos, and some tips on how to reduce the development. And they're working on this right now for insects and diseases. And my understanding is that the insect portion will be ready soon. So check it out. It's a great resource. We have lots of different products that are registered in Canada in agriculture from different modes of action, and I've tried to break them down into sort of nerve and muscle versus growth versus energy, mid-gut disruption, and unclassified. Those colors are also being used by the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, and they just basically, it makes it a little bit easier to understand how these different products work. So for example, things that affect growth regulation are probably going to work a lot slower than something that is effective on the nerves and muscles. So As you can see, there are quite a few products. The ones that I've put here are products that are in purple, are registered for management of aphids in Canada. We have some great resources in Ontario, and I know that they have them in other provinces as well. You can check out our fruit crop protection guide, our IPM guide. We've also got crop IPM for apple and for tender fruit in Ontario. So I'm actually going to hand the presentation over to Anne now, and she is going to talk about a new insecticide.
Great. Thanks very much, Hannah. I'll start. My name is Anne McCrae. As was mentioned at the beginning, I work for BASF as a technical specialist, and I'm going to introduce our new insecticide called Versus. So Versus is registered for the control of piercing and sucking pests, being aphids and whiteflies. So for Versus, there are three key characteristics that I'm going to review with you, and they are the performance, unique mode of action, and a little bit of talk on beneficials. The first characteristic is performance and how quickly Versus stops aphids from feeding. So to explain that a little better, I'm going to show a short video. So the following is a close-up view of aphids feeding. The time at the bottom is in minutes and is sped up to show you how fast the aphid will react to the insecticide. As you can see, the timer is counting down, and at the 0 mark, both Versus and the competitor insecticide are applied, and the untreated is left alone. When an aphid is very still and not moving, it usually means it is feeding. It needs to remain in one spot to pierce the leaf. A moving aphid, therefore, is not feeding and can no longer damage the leaf. So as you can see, Versus causes the aphid to move around uncontrollably. It can no longer eat and is therefore no longer damaging your crop, which is good for all parties involved. Another interesting way to look at this feeding cessation is with water-sensitive paper. Aphids, while feeding, produce honeydew, as Hannah mentioned in her presentation, when they eat. Honeydew is a wet, sticky substance that can build up on the leaves. In this experiment, the amount of honeydew was counted in the form of droplets. By placing a leaf infested with aphids over top of a small wheel with water-sensitive paper. And the honeydew droplets were tallied approximately every hour. So this graph is the result of that experiment. The top line is the control with no insecticide, and the bottom line is Versus. Within the first hour, the droplets produced in the Versus treatment were less than half of those produced in the control. And then after about 24 hours, or any in the Versus treatment, the has completely stopped. Last season, in 2018, we were fortunate enough to have some field research authorization trials, which means we could go to a grower and ask them to test out our Versus product on their own farm. These are some of the photos they took from those trials. So in the pictures on the left-hand side, we're looking at a before application photo. In the middle two photos, we have 36 hours after application, and then the right-hand side, those two photos are 48 hours after application, showing the level of control of aphids. And in this case, they were green apple aphids. So now that we have reviewed performance, the second characteristic I want to talk about is the unique mode of action. Versus is in a new chemical class, group 9, and a unique subclass 9D. This adds another tool in the toolbox for resistance management, as there is no cross-resistance to any other insecticide. This will help to prevent the development of resistance or to manage populations that have already begun to develop tolerance to other chemistries. So I was briefly mentioned by Hannah about breaking down our insecticides. There are approximately 30 IRAC insecticide groups that can be sort of broken down into three major classes. The first are neuromuscular disruptors, the second respiration disruptors, and the third insect growth and development regulators. The first two, the neuromuscular and respiration, are fast-acting, and they usually see their effects within the first 24 hours. Growth and development regulators are slower-acting and take more than 24 hours to start to affect the insect pest. Versus, as we saw in the video, is fast-acting, and so falls under the neuromuscular disruptor. So now that we know that Versus is this fast-acting neuromuscular disruptor, similar to a neonic or a pyrethroid or a diamide, we also know it is not in the same class. So Versus is different. It is a group 9D and is called a pyropene. It attacks the chordotonal organs. Chordotonal organs are responsible for sensors in the antennae, mouth, legs, wings, and thorax, and they provide insects with their senses of hearing, orientation, and balance. Versus disrupts the chordotonal organs by locking the sensory channel open, which sends these continuous and misleading signals. The brains can no longer detect sound or gravity or body movement. Similar, if we were kind of to take, if we wanted to know what it would feel like, it's when you go to the doctor and they hit your knee with a rubber hammer and your leg pops up and you can't control that. It's a similar sort of feeling that you saw in the video with the aphid, where it appears to be dancing around and moving uncontrollably and can no longer control its movements. And as a result, the aphid will die from starvation and dehydration. Lastly, but certainly not least, Versus has a very low impact on predatory and parasitic insects, such as lady beetles, which makes Versus an excellent resource for your integrated pest management programs. An experiment was done to test this theory of whether Versus affects lady beetle larvae. It compared the effects of water only and Versus and found that there was no significant difference between the two, as is seen in this graph. So Versus did not affect larval survival of ladybird beetles. I also wanted to review some of our best management practices when using Versus. The most important management practice is coverage on the plant. Versus is translaminar, so that it will move from the top of the leaf to the bottom, but it is not systemic. So a high enough water volume should be used for full coverage of the crop to get best results. Adjuvants are not required, but can be used for that improved coverage. Some of the other management practices to be aware of are that the rain fast is 1 hour. It's stable at a wide range of pH from 4 to 9, and a range of minus 10 degrees to 40 degrees Celsius, so no issues with temperature. The following table lists all of the crops and pests that are currently listed on our Versus label. We have a broad range of fruit and vegetable crops, and I won't list them all, but you can see them there. I do want to touch on one question that is frequently asked when looking at the list for plum fruit. So under apples, we do control rosy apple aphid and green apple aphid, but we do not list woolly apple aphid. So I'll just kind of answer that. As we heard in Hannah's talk, that rosy apple aphids turn up very early in the season. So our recommendation is, if you do have issues in certain parts of your orchard with woolly apple aphids, is to use Versus very early in the season to cover rosy apple aphid, and that leaves other groups of chemistries that you can use later to control your woolly apple aphid. However, if you do not have an issue with woolly apple aphid, you are welcome to use Versus at any time to control both rosy apple aphid and green apple aphid. So with that, just a quick review of Versus insecticide. The quick onset of feeding cessation, so fast performance. It's a new tool for resistant management. It's a unique 9D mode of action called a pyropene, and it's safe for use on, it's safe on beneficials, so good for your integrated pest management. And if you'd like to look at any more information on this product, you can check out the website of eggsolutions.ca/horticulture and look up Versus. And that's all we have for today. Thanks very much for listening in.
Great, thank you so much for your presentations. We will now move into the question and answer session. I will start with this question here. When do the GPAs move away from apples to potato crops? And can overwintering populations transmit virus diseases?
Okay, so the question was when do green peach aphid move off peach and onto summer hosts, including potatoes, and can they transmit viruses? So the green peach aphid usually has a few generations on peach before it will move off onto the summer host. Usually this will, it will depend, obviously every year is a little bit different, but usually this will occur sometime in June. Often when the leaves of peach are starting to become maybe a little less tasty for the aphid, that's one of the reasons that they will move off. So it's really always important to monitor your summer crops, like your summer veg, for the incoming aphids that are occurring. Green peach aphids, yes, they do transmit viruses. I mean, there's a number of them. It's, as I mentioned, it's a pest of a lot of different crops. It feeds on a lot of different things. It's flying around sampling a lot of things, and it's like a dirty needle. A flying syringe is the way we like to refer to them. So yeah, the green peach aphid, it does move. There is some variability of when those alate or those winged forms will develop, but they will move on to their summer hosts, usually sometime starting in June onwards.
Great. The next question, can Versus be used on high bush blueberries for aphid control, and what is the PHI?
So currently we don't have high bush blueberries on our label for Versus, but BSF continues to study this product and in the hopes to expand the label and that. So there wouldn't be a PHI for blueberries, but if you do go onto the website eggsolutions.ca/horticulture, and just the label will be right there, so it can give you PHI for all of the other crops.
Great. And just one more question here as we're running out of time. Any comments about bee toxicity and recommendations for bee safety?
Sure. So this is Anne. I can give you, so for bee toxicity for Versus, field studies were conducted to show that Versus has no effects on honeybee colony development, but it can have like short-term effects for bee coordination. So with, I guess, with all insecticides as well as Versus, it's always recommended to reduce the exposure to bees in their habitats and not apply insecticides or not apply Versus during a crop's blooming period. So apply during times of the day when bees are not foraging, such as in the evening, when the bees are safely in their hives.
Great. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you everybody who sent in questions. If your question was not addressed in the webinar, we will be following up with those questions after the presentation. So please don't feel that we are not going to answer your question or not to send any more questions if you do have something that comes up following this event. And then once again, I would like to thank Anna and Hannah for their presentations today. I'd also like to thank BASF for sponsoring the presentation. As I mentioned previously, the session has been recorded, and we will be sending that out to everyone who has registered in a follow-up email. It will also be available on our website at fruitandveggie.com. I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please stay tuned for future presentations from Fruit and Veg.